I didn't expect the day to feel so heavy. The kind of weight that settles over your chest, pressing down until every breath feels too deliberate, too loud. Outside, the rain was unrelenting, pouring in thick, diagonal sheets that rattled against the windows like a warning. The house felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in with each passing minute, and I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been gnawing at me since morning. I shifted on the couch, my fingers drumming an uneven rhythm against my thigh as I glanced at the clock again. 5 minutes had passed since I'd last checked. Maybe less. My best friend, Emily's brother, was supposed to be back hours ago, but the storm had thrown everything off. Delays. Traffic. Excuses. I should have just gone home when he texted to say he'd be late, but for some reason I hadn't. And now, here I was alone in his house with her. Emily. She was curled up in the armchair across from me, one leg tucked beneath her, her head tilted just enough to keep her book at the perfect angle. She hadn't said much since her brother left, just a polite hey and a small smile when I'd walked in. But even in silence, her presence filled the room. It always did. There was something about her, something I could never quite define. She wasn't loud or flashy like some people are when they're trying to take up space. No, Emily had this quiet intensity, like she didn't need to do anything at all to draw you in. Like gravity. I'd always noticed her. How could I not? From the way she carried herself, effortlessly confident, to the way her eyes seemed to linger a second longer than they should, like she was studying you, reading you, peeling back layers you didn't even realize you were wearing. It made me nervous. It made me wonder what she saw when she looked at me. And it made me frustrated because I knew I was spending too much time wondering. Her hand had brushed mine earlier when she handed me a cup of coffee. Such a small, stupid thing, and yet the warmth of it still lingered, a phantom sensation that refused to fade no matter how hard I tried to shake it off. I hated it. Hated that something so insignificant could leave me feeling so unsettled. I stared at the TV, its muted screen flickering with a sitcom I wasn't really watching. It gave me something to focus on, something to pretend I cared about so I wouldn't have to deal with the fact that Emily's presence was messing with my head. Her soft breaths filled the quiet spaces in the room, steady and unbothered, while I felt like my own lungs were working overtime just to keep up. I knew staying here alone with her was a bad idea. The logical part of my brain told me to leave, to grab my coat and mumble some excuse about the weather or an early morning tomorrow. But I didn't move. I couldn't. There was something magnetic about her, something that kept me tethered to that couch even though every instinct screamed at me to go. I stole a glance in her direction, trying to be subtle, but of course she caught me. Her eyes lifted from her book, locking onto mine with that same quiet intensity that always left me feeling exposed. She didn't say anything, just held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary before turning back to her page, like she knew exactly what I was thinking and was daring me to admit it. It was infuriating. I swallowed hard and looked away, forcing my attention back to the TV. My fingers gripped the edge of the cushion beneath me, desperate for something solid to anchor me. But even that didn't help. The room felt too warm, too close, and it had nothing to do with the weather. The rain pounded harder against the windows, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound that made the silence between us even more deafening. Every now and then, I thought about breaking it, asking her about her book or the storm or anything that might make things feel less charged. But every time I opened my mouth, the words got stuck in my throat. So I stayed quiet, letting the tension coil tighter and tighter around us like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was imagining the way her gaze kept drifting toward me, the way her lips curved slightly at the edges like she was holding back some private thought. Or maybe she really could see through me, through all the carefully constructed walls I'd spent years building. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. Being alone with Emily was dangerous. Not in the obvious sense, not in a way anyone else would notice. But for me, for my sanity, it was a threat I wasn't sure I could handle. Yet here I was, sitting on the edge of the couch, waiting for her brother to come home and save me from whatever was building in this room. I told myself I could hold it together, that I could sit here, weather the storm, and leave without making a fool of myself. But as the minutes ticked by, as the storm outside grew fiercer, and as her presence pressed heavier on me with every stolen glance, I started to wonder if I was lying to myself. Because the truth was, I didn't trust myself around her. Not with the way she looked at me. Not with the way I felt when she did. It started innocently enough. The lights flickered once, A quick and sharp flash that lit up the room for half a heartbeat before plunging us back into the dim gray light of the storm. Then it happened again. A second flicker, this one longer, as though the power itself were struggling to hang on. And then nothing. Darkness swallowed the room, save for the pale, shifting light of the storm pressing against the windows. Emily sighed, shutting her book with a soft thud that sounded louder than it should have. "Well, this is fun," she said, her voice carrying a teasing warmth that felt oddly out of place against the sudden hush in the house. I let out a dry laugh, my hands gripping the edge of the couch a little tighter than necessary. "Guess we're really stuck now." My voice sounded strained, even to me. I hoped she wouldn't notice, but I knew better. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the rain outside and the faint creaks of the old house as the wind pushed against it. Emily rose from the armchair with an easy grace, brushing her hair back from her face as she stretched. The movement was casual, almost careless, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made it impossible not to watch. She turned to me, her silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the storm outside, and raised an eyebrow. "We should find candles," she said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. I nodded, forcing myself to stand. "Yeah, good idea." My voice was too quiet, too flat. I followed her into the hallway, my steps slower, more hesitant than hers. She seemed perfectly at ease, walking ahead of me like she belonged to the shadows, her confidence unshaken by the darkness. I tried to focus on the task at hand, on the thought of finding the candles and getting some light back into the house, but it was impossible to ignore how close we were, how the narrow hallway seemed to press us together. She opened the kitchen drawer first, her fingers moving with familiarity as she searched. I stood beside her, too aware of the way her shoulder brushed mine as she moved. The dim light from the windows barely reached us here, turning her features into soft outlines, shadows and edges that I couldn't stop staring at. "Try the other drawer," she said, glancing at me over her shoulder. There was a hint of amusement in her tone, like she could sense my discomfort and found it endearing. I nodded again, fumbling to open the drawer next to hers. And that's when it happened. I reached into the drawer just as she did, my hand moving toward the same spot at the same moment. Her fingers grazed mine first, a light touch, accidental, harmless. But then, instead of pulling back, her hand stilled, resting on top of mine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the warmth of her skin seeped into mine, burning, impossible to ignore. Something shifted. It wasn't just the touch. It was the way she didn't move away, the way her fingers lingered like she was testing me, waiting to see what I would do. The air between us seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as though the storm outside had found its way in. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure she could hear it, but I couldn't bring myself to move. "Are you always this tense?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Her words weren't teasing, not really. They were laced with something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. Curiosity, maybe. Mischief. A challenge. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, but no words came. I wanted to say something, to laugh it off, to make it go away, but I was rooted to the spot, caught in the pull of her gaze. Her eyes held mine, steady and unflinching, and for a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just this. The faint glow of the storm, the heat of her hand on mine, the way she looked at me like she was daring me to say something, to do something. Her lips curved into a slow, deliberate smile, one that sent a ripple of heat through me despite the cool air of the kitchen. "You didn't answer me," she murmured, her fingers shifting ever so slightly, brushing against mine in a way that was anything but accidental now. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. Instead, I felt my chest tighten, a weight pressing down on me as I stood there, trapped between the drawer and her gaze. She tilted her head, watching me with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and certainty, like she already knew the answer to whatever question she was silently asking. "You don't have to be," she said, her voice softer now, almost gentle. Her hand moved then, just a little, her fingers tracing the edge of my wrist with a lightness that sent a shiver up my arm. My breath hitched, and I knew she noticed because her smile deepened, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. I should have pulled away. I should have laughed, made a joke, done anything to break the tension that was crackling like electricity between us. But I didn't. I couldn't. It was as though her touch had rooted me to the spot, every nerve in my body alive and screaming for something I didn't want to admit. "Emily," I finally managed, but my voice was barely a whisper, rough and unsteady. I didn't know what I was going to say, but it didn't matter. She leaned in slightly, just enough to close the space between us, her breath warm against my skin. "Relax," she said softly, her fingers curling ever so slightly around mine, anchoring me in place. The word felt like a command, impossible to obey, and yet something in her tone made me want to try. She wasn't backing down. I could see it in the way her eyes stayed locked on mine, daring me to respond, to react, to do anything but stand there like a statue. But I didn't. And as her smile widened, I realized she already knew I wouldn't. The storm outside seemed to grow louder with every passing minute, the rain hammering against the windows like it was trying to get in. Wind whistled through the cracks, sending an occasional shiver through the room despite the candle flickering between us. The flame cast long, dancing shadows across the walls, making everything feel both intimate and unsettling, like we were the only two people left in the world. Emily sat across from me, draped in the edge of the blanket she'd pulled off the couch earlier. She held it loosely in her lap, her fingers toying with the fringe, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But her gaze kept flicking to me, a quiet intensity in her eyes that made my pulse quicken every time I caught her looking. She wasn't trying to hide it anymore, wasn't pretending she wasn't watching me. And that, more than anything, left me completely off balance. I shifted in my seat, trying to focus on the candlelight, on the steady rhythm of the rain, on anything but her. My knee bounced restlessly, my hands gripping the armrests of the chair as though anchoring myself there would keep me steady. But it wasn't working. The tension in the room was unbearable, thick enough to choke on, and it felt like every breath I took was louder than it should have been. She hadn't said anything for a while, but I could feel her watching me, could feel the weight of her presence pressing down on me, and it was impossible to ignore. "You're awfully quiet tonight," she said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was low and steady, but there was something deliberate about the way she spoke, like she was testing me, seeing how far she could push. I glanced at her, my stomach twisting. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. She shrugged, her lips curving into a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just, you don't seem like yourself. Is it the storm? Or is it something else?" The way she said it, the slight lilt at the end, made it clear she wasn't really asking about the storm. I looked away, back at the candle. The flame flickered, twisting and bending as though it too was trying to escape the weight in the air. "I don't know what you want me to say," I admitted, my voice cracking under the pressure of everything I'd been holding back. It was the truth. I didn't know what to say, how to make sense of the mess of thoughts and feelings swirling inside me. All I knew was that she was pushing me closer to a line I wasn't sure I could keep anymore. Emily didn't answer right away. She let the silence hang between us, stretching it out until I thought I might snap under the strain. Then finally, she leaned forward, resting her elbow on her knee and propping her chin in her hand. Her eyes caught the light of the candle, glinting with something that looked a lot like certainty. "Maybe," she said, her tone soft but steady, "you could stop pretending you don't feel it too." The words hit me like a gut punch, knocking the air from my lungs. I opened my mouth to deny it, to say something, anything, that would diffuse the moment, but nothing came. My chest felt tight, my thoughts spinning too fast to catch hold of any one of them. She smiled then, slow and deliberate, like she knew exactly what I was thinking and was daring me to prove her wrong. "You're so tense," she murmured, her voice dropping lower, softer. She shifted in her seat, closing the space between us inch by inch until her knees almost brushed mine. "It's okay, you know. You don't have to fight it." I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the armrests so tightly that my knuckles ached, but I couldn't let go. Her words were unraveling something inside me, something I'd tried so hard to keep locked away, and I didn't know how to stop it. "Emily," I started, but she moved closer before I could finish, leaning forward just enough that her hand brushed against mine. This time, it wasn't accidental. It was deliberate enough to leave no room for doubt. Her fingers lingered, light and warm, and it felt like every nerve in my body was suddenly on fire. "Tell me to stop," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers traced the edge of my wrist, a slow, deliberate motion that sent shivers racing up my arm. "If you want me to stop, just say the word." But I didn't. I couldn't. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down at the drop below, my heart pounding in my ears. Everything in me screamed that this was wrong, that I needed to pull back, to say something that would put an end to whatever this was before it went too far. But her touch was magnetic, grounding me in place even as it threatened to pull me under. "Emily," I said again, her name a whisper on my lips, shaky and uncertain. She tilted her head, her eyes locked on mine, and there was no mistaking the challenge there. The silent question she wasn't afraid to ask. "What?" she said, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "You can't even say it, can you?" The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell her to stop. Because as much as I wanted to believe I could walk away from this, from her, I knew deep down that I didn't want to. And judging by the look in her eyes, she knew it too. I don't know how it happened, whether it was the storm outside with its relentless pounding against the windows, or the storm inside me, growing louder and fiercer with every second. But something finally broke. That line I'd promised myself I'd never cross, the one I'd convinced myself I was strong enough to hold, blurred into nothing. And in its place, there was only her. Emily. Her touch was fire. That's the only way I can describe it. The moment her hand slid across mine, lacing her fingers through with a confidence that left me breathless, it felt like she had ignited something in me that I couldn't extinguish. Every nerve in my body was alive, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to pull away, to salvage whatever thin shred of self-control I had left. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Her presence was magnetic, impossible to resist, and before I could think, I was leaning into it, into her, as if she were the only thing keeping me grounded. I let out a shaky breath as her other hand brushed lightly against my cheek, her fingertips trailing down the side of my face with an intimacy that made my pulse race. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, charged with something I didn't know how to name but couldn't deny. My eyes searched hers, desperate for some kind of answer, some kind of sign that this wasn't a mistake, but all I found was certainty, unshakable, overwhelming certainty. "I knew it," she whispered, her voice low, soft, and devastatingly sure. Her breath was warm against my skin, and it sent a shiver down my spine that left me trembling. The way she looked at me in that moment, like she had always known this was where we'd end up, unraveled whatever was left of my resolve. I wanted to say something, anything, to make sense of the chaos crashing inside me, but words failed me. All I could do was look at her, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break free from my chest. She was so close, her face barely inches from mine, her eyes locked onto me with an intensity that made it impossible to breathe. And then, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance. The world seemed to tilt on its axis the moment it happened. The storm outside faded to a dull roar. The flickering candlelight became nothing more than a blur, and all I could focus on was her. The softness of her touch, the way her breath hitched when my hand moved to her wrist, the way she tilted her head just enough to meet me halfway, it was overwhelming. It was everything. For a brief, suspended moment, it felt like the world had disappeared entirely, leaving only us. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking. I wasn't second-guessing, wasn't overanalyzing, wasn't holding myself back. I was just feeling. Her touch, her presence, her certainty, it consumed me, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. But then, like a thunderclap splitting the sky, the sound of the front door snapping open shattered everything. It was loud, jarring, and impossible to ignore. I flinched, pulling back so fast it felt like I'd been caught in freefall. The spell broke, the storm outside rushing back in as reality crashed down around us. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and all I could do was sit there, frozen, as my best friend's voice echoed from the hallway. "Hello. You guys still here?" His voice was casual, light, completely unaware of the storm he'd just walked into. Emily leaned back, but she didn't move away completely. Her hand lingered on mine for just a second longer than it should have, her fingers brushing against my skin with an almost deliberate slowness before she finally let go. When she pulled back, her expression was impossible to read, calm, composed, but with a glint of something in her eyes that made my stomach twist. I couldn't bring myself to look at her. My thoughts were a mess, tangled and frayed, and all I could focus on was the sound of my best friend's footsteps moving closer. I needed to steady myself, needed to push all of this, whatever this was, out of my head before it was too late. But Emily wasn't making it easy. She leaned in again, her movement so subtle it felt like it was meant just for me. Her lips brushed against my ear as she whispered, her voice soft and teasing, but with an edge of certainty that left no room for doubt. "This isn't over," she said, her breath warm against my skin. And then she was gone, slipping back into her seat as if nothing had happened, as if the storm she'd started between us wasn't still raging inside me. I stared at her, my chest tight, my mind racing, but she didn't look at me. Instead, she picked up the blanket she'd dropped earlier, pulling it over her lap with a casual ease that made me question if I'd imagined the whole thing. The door to the living room swung open, and my best friend stepped inside, his hair damp from the rain and a bag of takeout in his hand. He looked between the two of us, his expression cheerful and oblivious. "Power still out, huh? At least I brought dinner." I nodded, forcing myself to smile, but the weight of what had just happened lingered, heavy and unspoken. Emily glanced at me then, just for a moment, and the small, knowing smirk that tugged at the corner of her lips sent a jolt of heat through me that I couldn't ignore. As I sat there, trying to steady my breath and clear my head, I knew one thing for certain. She was right. This wasn't over. The storm outside might have been passing, but the one she'd started between us was only just beginning. And no matter how much I wanted to deny it, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew there was no going back.